Welcome back. In today's video, we're going to talk about sin and why is the church is not talking about sin and why is the world don't want you to talk about sin. If you're new here, please subscribe, and as always, have a blessed day.
Frankly, sin isn't nearly as marketable as other things. Today in our culture, I think it would be fair to say that sin isn't even an acceptable word. You don't hear anybody talk about sin, certainly not a politician, rarely a preacher in some cases. Not only is it an unacceptable word, it is an unacceptable cause for the troubles of man. With all this talk about values and no talk about sin, the definition of values is hopelessly vague. Certainly, sin is not an acceptable diagnosis of man's problems. We look at the world, and what do we see? We see evil everywhere, but it's not defined as evil. We see sin everywhere, but it's not defined as sin. It's not an acceptable word, it's not an acceptable cause, it's not an acceptable diagnosis of man's nature. In fact, things that we used to willingly say were sin, we don't want to call sin anymore. There was a column in the August 29th Dallas Morning News written by columnist Ann Melvin. Most sins have gained respectability through politics or profitability. They're mostly all legalized, advertised, organized, supervised, and taxed. We've got liquor by the drink and young girls dressed like hookers just to be in fashion at their homecoming dance. We've got your basic graphic sex on cable TV and an entertainment market from wind-up toys to electronic state-of-the-art based solely on violence. So, hey, is it fair to name all these little diversions sins? She goes on, sin, go figure out how you can make a fortune for Time Warner with a recording about killing cops. How you can refuse to let school children say grace for lunch and then teach them how to use a condom before recess. Clearly, we are foundering here a society preoccupied with values yet hopelessly vague on sin. End quote. It isn't just the politicians and it isn't just the profit takers who want to market sin and sell it. The politicians don't want to talk about sin because they don't want to alienate any sinning votes. The entrepreneurs and materialists don't want to talk about sin because they can sell it. The government doesn't want to talk about sin because they can tax it. But what is really most amazing, I guess, of all is that even the people helpers, the counselors, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, they don't want to talk about sin either. And again, I remind you, they don't want to talk about sin because they don't want to deal with the sin in their own lives, and secondly, because sin doesn't sell very well. Sickness sells a lot better. Addiction is a much nicer word than iniquity. I read a book yesterday. The title of it is, I'm Dysfunctional, You're Dysfunctional. It's a short book. I read it in the morning, and then I thought about it in the afternoon. It's written by a lady by the name of Wendy Kaminer, and it's a secular book. And in this secular book, she confronts, as a critic, the new anthropology, the new theology, the new psychology. That new stuff that is called abuse psychology or codependency, all of that kind of stuff that basically is saying you're really a wonderful person and everybody keeps abusing you. And what's happening outside of you is the problem because everything inside of you is so wonderful. She talks about the fact that this new anthropology, this new sociology, psychology, theology, and she even lists secular sociologists, secular psychiatrists, Christian psychologists, all into one big bag as all affirming basically the same thing. She writes this in evaluating the movement and articulating what they believe. This isn't her view, but this is what she says they are espousing. No matter how bad you've been in the narcissistic 1970s and the acquisitive 1980s, no matter how many drugs you've ingested or sex acts you've performed, or how much corruption you've enjoyed, you're still essentially innocent. The divine child inside you is always untouched by the worst of your sins. And then she further says that these new definers of man's nature say, quote, because no one is inhabited by evil or unhealthy urges, because inside every addict, it's the new word for sinner, is a holy child yearning to be free. And then she goes on assessing what they say. They say inner children are always good, innocent, and pure, like the most sentimentalized Dickens characters, which means that people are essentially good and evil is merely a mask, a dysfunction. She says the therapeutic view of evil as sickness, not sin, is strong in codependency theory. That's that new kind of theory. Shaming children, for example, is considered a primary form of abuse. In other words, what she's saying, if I can digress, is that if you make your child feel any shame about anything, any guilt about anything, that is a form of child abuse. That will wind up, you can be sure, in the courts, and it already has, as child abuse. She goes on, both guilt and shame are not useful, they say. And then she adds, someone should remind these people that there is a name for people who lack guilt and shame. They're called sociopaths. She's right. But here is a secular writer looking at the face of the people-helping industry and saying these people are saying that innately, inside, in the deepest heart of men, he is innocent, pure, holy, and good. Boy, it's amazing how all these people who are that way on the inside can be so rotten on the outside. The point is this: you basically have a culture that denies the reality of sin. And as we said in our discussions about homosexuality, if you misdiagnose the problem, then you're not going to be able to offer the proper cure. So what happens is, if you alleviate people of the responsibility for dealing with the sin in their lives, you have, in effect, made them unredeemable. You have damned them. That's the kind of culture we live in. Not just minimizing sin, but eliminating it. And then coming up with the unbelievable idea that man is some kind of good, holy, pure thing inside, longing to be free from these terrible dysfunctions that have occurred on his outside because of the way he's been abused by others, usually his parents. Now, we're victims to some extent of that kind of thing in our culture. We have as wicked as wretched, as sinful, and as vile a culture as could be imagined. And at the same time, we have a massive campaign to remove the word sin from our vocabulary. You talk about putting people in an unredeemable position. They aren't even going to understand that they are responsible for their own offense against God. They're not even going to be in a position to seek a deliverer from their iniquity. Thus, they are unredeemable. I can't imagine that Satan could have devised any more effective plan than to move a culture toward the most wretched, vile kind of life, and at the same time sell it wholesale the philosophy that no such thing as sin exists innately in the human heart. Talk about damning a culture, damning a world. That's how to do it. Now, the fallout to this we feel in the church. And the church tends to minimize the reality of sin, even in its own life, even among Christians. We tend to be desensitized, don't we, to the iniquity around us. And if we are desensitized, let me tell you this, to the iniquity around us, we will be desensitized to the iniquity in us. If I am not outraged by the sin I see outside, then I will be less likely to be outraged by the sin I see inside. People always decry the Victorian era, periods of history where even the society itself has had a highly developed sense of sin. But those kinds of societies at least articulated a morality that held the church accountable. Now, society holds the church accountable for nothing because society has no morality, no definition of sin. Therefore, the church can behave itself in just about any way it wants. In fact, I imagine today that because of the way the church has behaved itself in our culture, it would be very hard for anybody in the church to do anything that would shock the world.